Welcome to the creative community. I'm your host, David Starkey, and my guest this time is poet Mary Ann McFadden. Mary Ann, welcome.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you here in our Ventura studio. You grew up not too far from here.
Yes, in Fillmore.
In Fillmore, you're a Fillmore girl, yeah.
First grade, or kindergarten through 12.
Okay. And you're a fourth generation Californian.
I am.
Tell me a little bit about that. That's unusual.
My great-grandfathers came by clipper ship to Orange County.
Okay.
And they built a little railroad into Santa Ana, and they cut down redwood trees, I have to say.
Yeah, don't tell anybody that yet.
And started in the very early days of California.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how did your family find its way up to Fillmore? It's an agricultural
yes,
ultimately
yeah.
enterprise.
Well, my grandfather had an orange ranch in Simi, and it's kind of a long story. My father died in World War II, and my mother remarried.
Okay.
And he was from Moore Park,
Okay.
and she'd grown up in Simi, and his sister was my mother's best friend in Simi, and so she knew him. They had dated in high school. So when my father died, he waited a year or so and then came courting.
Okay.
and he had a business in Fillmore, but he always wanted to farm, so eventually they bought a ranch. Yeah.
Well, I want to hear poems from your book, Devil Deer. And I told you before the camera started rolling, I was going to kind of let you you drive the ship. So what's a poem that you'd like to read to our audience?
Well, I was thinking about, I know I've seen a few of these videos, and sometimes you ask people how they got started and stuff. And this is a very old poem that the woman who was my mentor, Carolyn Kaiser, gave as an assignment at a poetry conference. And so, the assignment was write a poem. The title has to be, it has to be Giving Up Writing.
Okay.
And the first word has to be goodbye.
Okay.
And so I wrote it, and it's one of those wonderful poems that came, the whole thing just kind of came. You know, which
it's a rare poem in my experience.
Yeah, so I've changed the title. It's now called Goodbye.
Okay.
Goodbye, dear monster. I wish you well. I hope you won't be judged by your scars. With your eyes of all sizes and colors, you could be a lighthouse or a prophet. And though you have too many thumbs and arms that are short for your great bulk, you can love. Am I not your mother? And haven't I scoured the planet all my life for such a heart? I'll never forget how I found it in the rail yard, chuffing in its impatience to labor. It was easy to find the redwoods, difficult to drag them home and join them to your torso. Over the years, how many children have I set lumbering toward the village? And of those who returned, how many odd parts are left, nodding, tapping toward some impossible future? You are the last and the best. You may be wondering why I gave you breasts. They are my own. Trust me.
So you mentioned Carolyn Kaiser, magnificent poet from the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
What all did you learn from her as a student?
Well, I wanted to mention that she used to talk about the Amazons and how they would slice off one breast so that it didn't get in the way of the bow and arrow. And so there was a little of that in this poem. Yeah. And she used to say, you don't have to tell the truth about what happened, but you have to tell the truth about your own emotions.
Okay.
And I always remember that.
That's a big difference, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, she said the barn could be brown, but if you want to rhyme
yellow,
it,
right?
if you want to rhyme it with
Right,
red,
right,
make it red. It
right.
doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay. And someone dear to both of us was a fellow student of yours, right, Jackson?
Yes. Yeah.
What was that like going to school with him?
Well, we weren't actually in classes together, but after I was Carolyn's student, I just, when I could, I would go where she was. Like if she was at a conference, I would try to go there if I could. Okay. And Jackson was at one of them in Santa Cruz. And, oh, she adored him.
Right.
I was even a little jealous, actually. But she was a wonderful teacher. And you had to be kind of tough. She could be very...
Right.
I saw her tell somebody that she just didn't have what it takes, and she should find another occupation. Thank God she didn't say that to me.
What happened to the person? Did they fall apart? Or
I don't think so. I think they were stubborn and
they stuck with
stayed
it.
the course. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Let's hear another poem from Devil Deer.
Okay. Let's see. Let me read a slightly long one.
Okay.
And this is in, I write a lot about animals. And this one is in 3 parts. And it's called, it's set in Mexico, in Mazatlan. And it's called Disco Saturday Night.
Okay.
Disco Saturday Night. One night in August, after a full 2 months of tropical heat, almost unnoticed in the glamour and glare, after a lifetime of swimming more or less alone, she glides into the beach and strikes sand and drags herself straight out of the water 30 yards and starts to dig. A crowd gathers, women with their shoes held in their hands, men in white shirts and leather. Someone has called the harbor police. Stand back, give her air. Give her room. By now she has made a shallow basin and has turned and started to lay. She has barely arrived in time. Wet and ripe, the white orbs pile over one another, each one deliberate, each one important, as the crowd murmurs and the cars slow down, and her eyes, glazed, seem not to see, not to understand. Her urge so strong, so compelling. She defecates and begins pushing sand over the nest with her paddles. Pushing, and then begins her trip back to the waves, half lifted and hurried along by the harbor police who will dig up her eggs to incubate them. When she hits the first wave, she lifts a little, then keeps crawling and hits the second wave, suddenly lithe and free, and with a few strong thrusts, escapes the light, the noise, the task, the scent of dogs and rats, and disappears headlong into the sea. It was not the thing itself. It should not have been remarkable. 100 years in the past, nobody would have noticed or stopped to watch one female among thousands, one nest with its ping-pong balls faintly luminous. We would have been digging, shoveling the piles of unborn islands, continents into a bag to be eaten without guilt, seasoned with lime juice and salt, lips smacked and singing. It was inexhaustible. It was a universe. It was like a woman giving herself for the first time, every time. Like sex that comes and goes and comes again, it was a divine food. How could anyone have turned away from what was offered and what was so clearly good? The turtle swims alone out of the wide bay. Overhead the swells, greens and yellows filtered by clouds of kelp, shadows of gray whales, whole herds moving with one mind to the warm waters where they will give birth, females spurting single child whales, shimmying free in shoals of blood, turning and nuzzling them up to the air, hosed clouds of milk in the water, nurturing the small ones as they bump and swim together, lumbering into the shadows, resting there. The turtle swims on, feeds and dives with her broad paddles pulling her. She does not think about her sons and daughters curled in their paper shells, the life throbbing in the jellied forms, the idea of turtle constant in them, the need to be cooled by the tide and warmed by the sun. She does not ask for anything, but leaves them there, impassive, trusting. Hours ago, she had already forgotten.
Well, you mentioned before you started reading that poem that writing about animals is a frequent topic. I mean, I can see why that's such a complex view of this laying of eggs that you have in the middle passage, that they were inexhaustible, but of course they're not inexhaustible at all.
We thought so at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
But talk to me more about why animals make good topics for your poems.
I think it's easier to write about the little things and hope that the significance for the big things comes through the poem. Because I think a poem should have a big topic in a way. But to take on the big topic directly is...
And the big topic is the end of the world
Yeah,
in a way.
yeah, right. Or it can be love, it can be death, it can be, confusion, all kinds of human things that you see, and I think it's easier to talk about in a small way. Just the way when someone's dog dies, they can mourn, they cry and cry and cry, but when their mother dies, sometimes it's too deep for that kind of grief.
Yeah.
You can't express it. It takes years, or a year or two anyway.
As a fellow poet, I find it really difficult to write about animals because I always am trying to keep from personifying them, to somehow honor whatever the animal intelligence is and still make an interesting poem. You managed to do that, and there's a human intelligence over everything, but you're also really trying to pay attention to what a turtle might think.
You don't have to personify them. People get it,
right.
One of the things Carolyn Kaiser said, she said, you can always tell a woman poet because she'll say the same thing 2 or 3 different ways, because women are used to not being listened to, whereas a man will just say it once. And I don't know what that has to do with what we were talking about before,
No,
but I do
something,
think that our readers are more intelligent than we often worry that, that they will be.
Right.
And so writing, I have another example of that
Sure,
I
I'd
might
love to hear it.
This is the situation was I was living in Mazatlan, and I had a cat that there were a lot of lizards in the backyard, and the cat would catch and eat one almost every day. And I got very nervous about it because I just felt bad, But I thought the cat's not really doing wrong. I mean, that's what cats do.
Right.
And so I wrote this, and thinking of the God in all things, I titled it "To the Lizard God." And I think it makes its point without ever stating it directly. To the lizard God. God of damnation, lizard God eaten alive each day by the cat, and your guts ground into the carpet, or flung, O God of abandonment, into a corner, God of stench, God of retribution, warm and soft in my paper napkin, tossed into the wastebasket, carried out with crumbs and paint flakes, fruit skins and onion husks, nail parings and hair fished from drains. with crushed bugs and blooded, swatted, stinging things, O God that gives and takes away, forget me in your pain. Turn your face from me in your suffering. Close your eyes upon me in the furnace of midday as you begin to rot, or in the tepid rain. When ants deliver your flesh to their queen, when your acids leak into dirt, when your frail bones fall into calcium and enter the clear blood of plants, when you are sipped at last to the top of the tree, think of me, O infant. When the brown moth alights on you and you give thanks, O God of the one everlasting touch, O breath, remember me.
That was a really fantastic poem, Mary Ann. There's a moment in the poem where you list all the garbage that the lizard is going out with, and initially I was thinking, oh, that's a little disrespectful, but even as the things get more grotesque, like hairfish from the drain, I feel this sense that everything is one, you know, that nail parings are also, they're in some way sacred as they go through. Was that part of?
Certainly.
See, yeah. I got it.
Yeah, you did.
You didn't
I'm glad.
have to explain it to me. Well, we have about 10 minutes left. You mentioned living in Mazatlan, and you lived in Mexico for 14 years. How did that come about?
Well, I had been living in New York, and it got really expensive. And I got so that I would sort of want to cry when I saw a tree. So I was thinking, how do I get to a beach? And it really wasn't very affordable any place except Mexico. And I actually had a branch of the family in Mexico, cousins in Mazatlan. So I went down there and started looking, and it was inexpensive and I could live. And after about 6 years, I moved to San Miguel de Allende, which is in the mountains. And had
lots of expatriates there. I
yeah,
know,
lots, and it had lots more culturally. And they had a library with something like
so
35,000 books in English.
Isn't that library fantastic?
Yeah.
That is
so,
the library of San Miguel de Allende is something that all people should
that meant everything to me, because it was very expensive to pay for books, ship them down, get them through customs and everything. It more than doubled it. So I'm a big reader. So
I was there. This is just a quick aside, for a couple of months learning Spanish in order to pass my Spanish test as a graduate student at UCLA, and I read through that library just ferociously. It was so good, and that was 20 years ago or longer. So let's hear, we've got, like I said, we have about 10-ish minutes left. I'd love to hear a few more poems from Devil Deer.
Here's one. I was going to title this book with this poem, but I got talked out of it. So it's set in Mazatlan, and it's called Letter from Paradise. But it's about a lot of other things, too. Anyway, Letter from Paradise. I want you to know that I found happiness, alive in little boys in Mazatlan at the summer solstice, when the tides had tipped from one end of the beach and left the sand in a crescent cliff exactly like the moon, Mother. A crescent cliff exactly like the moon. I saw a dozen little boys, not a girl child among them, orphans perhaps, or shoeshine experts, or gum salesmen, or acrobats who should have been in school. The waves crashed them into the sand, and counter waves peaked and slopped and sloshed them, washed them. And then a crushing tree trunk heaved toward where they swam. 12 little boys, each with an arm and leg to be maimed, each with a chest full of air, with me wanting to warn them away, rode and plunged and climbed and fell and slipped and escaped and hung on. Life's tragic face, the arrows shot straight up, fell somewhere else, somewhere the boys didn't care about. They were there on the beach, carried in and out while the sun sank and the day got dark, not stopping to rest, pulling their pants up and running right back forever.
You know, you mentioned Carolyn Kaiser a couple times, but when I hear your poems, I hear someone who's deeply familiar with poetry in English. Who are some other poets that you admire and that have maybe found their way into your work?
Well, her teacher was Theodore Rutke,
Right.
and so she taught him magnificently, and he's had a big effect on me. You know, he started writing, every poem he wrote in his first book was in iambic pentameter, every single poem. And then he had that mastered, and he broke out and did all kinds of things. The childhood poems,
Right.
that are some very strange poems in there, and then some wonderful ones. And then at the end, he's got these long rolling lines, you know, of just gorgeous poems.
Right.
Yeah.
So those two poets, who else?
Oh, some of my favorites. You know, all the usual people. Elizabeth Bishop was wonderful.
Another poet who writes about travel.
Yes,
extensively.
yeah. And Wallace Stevens. Yeah, he was wonderful.
Yeah.
And of course, Mary Ann Moore was
Right.
great. And I'm trying to think who else. I'm not prepared to ask this.
Yeah,
so this is what happened when you get old. Your mind goes blank.
It's a tough question to throw at somebody. Well, we got about 6.5 minutes. We can at least get one more. I'd love if we could hear from, get two more poems before the show's over.
Let's see here. I know I'm not supposed to be.
You're flipping through it. I
Okay.
put the
Here's
onus on you.
another old one. It's called Like Candles. Like Candles. Thinking on this rainy day of old lovers, like candles blown out on a cake. I hate how life shrinks the huge fish I caught and photographed, which 10 years later looks like a small perch. And the house I lived in once, with its vaulted rooms, which turns out to be quite ordinary. Even the ranch, which was my universe, caught by a backward glance from the new highway at 70 miles per hour as I speed toward my death, is just a dimple in the hills, tilted and spinning away into space. And the breasts, the areolas I woke to touch, the fragrances, the silks and secrets, the bell voice breaking over me like morning light. The fried egg, happy on its plate, surfaces for this moment and slips away. I don't know why, now my life is steady as a train on its track, I regret what I lost. Like a coin tossed into a river of cash, a dime I held and warmed in my fist. I traded that for this.
That's a poem Elizabeth Bishop, I think, would have been proud to have written. Could you find a short poem to finish up with us?
Yes. How about No Condors? I grew up, Fillmore is the home of the California condor.
Yeah.
So I wrote this only partly about condors. No
Okay.
condors in sight.
Okay.
We launch our bodies over the cliffs. Our answering wings circle us up 3,000 feet to glide along the ancient flyways. Over the spreading citrus, dry riverbeds of the Santa Clara and the Sespe. Over the small pink house, a dog barks, a woman looks up. Out of the sun's disk, black spots, black motionless wings sail west 40 miles, or northwest to the islands. The dog barks, the woman raves, her children stretch into their lives. We veer into a spiral laden with dark birds, whose cries swell the air as we descend, to plunge into the rot-soft carcass again and again until the heart bursts and the maw lies open. Bloat and release, gorge and surcease, there is enough. Soaring the full, unruly winds of the Pacific, over the fields of bean and sugar beet, startled towns, the pink house where the father withers, over the laps of foothills, fossil shells pushing out of the clay, the new range sheer by the old, wings whistling, 50 miles an hour we fly.
That's a poem written by someone from Fillmore.
Yes.
I mean, it's so important to translate one's lived life, I think, into poetry. And that sort of cues me up, as we just got about 2 minutes left, to ask my normal final question, which is to say what advice the guests might give to people who are aspiring to work in her area as poets in this case.
Somebody whose name I can't remember, I think it was John Berryman, said, somebody asked him, how do you know if your poem is good? And he said, you never know, and you never will. And if you have to know, don't be a poet. And I have found that to be true. I mean, one day I love it, and the next day I hate it.
Yeah.
And you just never know. You just have to do your best.
But the poems in your book, at some point you thought, these are pretty good. I mean, is there something about, is it a line, a phrase, a cluster of images? Is there something that for you says, oh, I just wrote a good poem?
There's some kind of magic that happens, and it's hard to talk about. It has to do with the language that you use, where it rises above just telling a story.
Okay.
And it becomes a poem. And I think it's because you get those goosebumps, It's suddenly speaking to the human condition and not just telling the little story that you tried to write. You know?
So,
and it's not something you do. You know what I mean? You write the words, but something else
you're
happens.
channeling something larger.
Something else comes into it. Yeah.
So that's that moment when you realize that's happened and it's been successfully.
And all you can do
page.
is feel thankful, really.
That's great. Well, it's been a real pleasure having you on the show, Mary Ann, getting to hear your work. So if you hold the book up real quick for folks. The Creative Community is produced here in Ventura by Phil Taggart and his fantastic crew. I'm your host, David Starkey, and we'll see you next time.